So let's take time. Let's take time to honor God at this time. Father, we thank you for working in our lives and we thank you for helping us in our situations. We ask for provision and protection for us, wisdom and strength. Help us to live for you. Guide us in our study. All these we pray in Christ's name. Amen. So we will talk about communicative language teaching. Communicative language teaching is a paradigm that emphasizes the use of language to communicate. All the other uh, language teaching methods are not as strong as CLT for communication. Its emphasis on communication. Proponents of CLT include Noam Chomsky, Stephen Krashen, and Larry Salinker. Communicative language teaching was based initially on innativism, then on communicative competence. Communicative competence means being able to say the right things the right way at the right time. Again, being able to say the right things the right way at the right time. Communicative competence was Delheim's reaction to Chomsky's emphasis on grammar alone. You see, Chomsky believed that if a language learner has learned the grammar, then he has learned the language. But according to Delheim's, there are so many things about language, not just grammar. Okay? So for example, how do you say pang ilang presidente si Trump? Or pakibariyahan mo nga ito in English. Now we're talking here about the natural way of saying it, not just the ones that we invented. Okay? So that's an illustration about communicative competence. Communicative competence involves social linguistic competence, discourse competence, and strategic competence. Let's talk about linguistic competence. When we say linguistic competence, this means being able to use the structural aspects of language, including pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. So, a linguistically competent person knows the grammar, can pronounce the words. He understands the words, and the person can use the structural aspects of a language. Then we also have the social linguistic competence. Social linguistic competence means being able to use language in a communicative situation. It includes societal norms and practices. So you know how to say things based on the requirements of the culture. So for example, when do you speak slowly? When do you speak softly? When do you use po and opo in Tagalog? Class, I encountered an American lady who was learning English. I was around 10 years old at that time, and the lady was probably around 30 years old. But when she talked to me, she would keep on using po and opo to me. Imagine I was 10 years old, so I was a little confused by a much older person than me talking to me with po and opo. So you cannot use definitely po and opo with a much younger person. Okay, so that's social linguistic competence. Social linguistic competence means being able to talk according to accepted ways in the culture. Then we also have discourse competence. Discourse competence means being able to participate in conversation, particularly how to string together sentences. How do you put sentences together in order to communicate or express yourself? That's discourse competence. Related to discourse competence is strategic competence. Strategic competence is knowing how to use strategies for clarification, how to start a discussion, how to start a conversation, how to repair a conversation, how to end a conversation, turn taking. Class, for example, during the time that I still did not know how to say pang ilang presidente si Donald Trump, this is how I would try to communicate. Um, George Washington was the first president of the United States. How about Donald Trump? Okay, so that's an example of strategic competence, being able to strategize in order to communicate. So we have linguistic competence, social linguistic competence, discourse competence, and strategic competence. Now, as a language teaching method, communicative language teaching tries to produce learning by creating situations that produce the following situations. First is interaction between the learner and users of the language. CLT prescribes or advises the idea of having the learner interact with users of the language. So this is somewhat built on Lev Vygotsky's idea that a learner can benefit well by interacting with a much more knowledgeable person. CLT also tries to produce learning by producing collaborative creation of meaning. Okay, so the idea is you try to communicate with each other and you derive meaning from your discussion. CLT tries to produce learning by creating situations such as creating meaningful and purposeful interaction through language. So the interaction that you have with other people through the use of language is meaningful and purposeful. You're able to achieve your purposes, the others are able to achieve their purposes. You see, class, the goal is not to acquire the form like behaviorism does, but to actually be able to use language to produce beneficial relationships. So it's not really the form that's being targeted, but being able to communicate using the language, producing beneficial relationships. CLT tries to produce learning by creating situations that produce the following situations: negotiation of meaning as the learner and the interlocutor arrive at an understanding. So, if there's misunderstanding, if there is lack of communication, if there's a gap in understanding, you employ negotiation of meaning, which is a nice way of saying clarify. You clarify so that you and the one you're talking to arrive at an understanding. You understand each other. Now, negotiation of meaning involves strategies to express one's ideas and purposes, and strategies to help the hearer understand what one is trying to say. So, for example, class, like when I told you and I still didn't know about pang ilang presidente si Donald Trump in English, I would say George Washington was the first president of the United States. How about Donald Trump? So even though I didn't actually know how to say the question in English, I was able to communicate. Okay, so the idea is to express your ideas and purposes through strategies so that you would be understood. CLT also tries to produce learning through attending to the feedback that learners get when they use the language. So you listen, you talk, and you listen to the feedback. that you get from others. And based on that feedback, you adjust your language, you clarify, or you take on strategies that would enable you to communicate. So the feedback from others is very important. Also, CLT tries to produce learning by creating situations where you pay attention to the language that you hear. That's called the input. And then trying to incorporate new forms into your developing communicative competence. So, class, for example, when I encountered a German boy, I once encountered a German boy, maybe around 4 years, maybe around 6 years old, and he didn't speak English. And he said to me, Ich bin Karl. Ich bin Karl. So I didn't speak German, but I concluded that he was introducing himself, and probably his name was Carl, and Ich bin was the way to introduce yourself. So I took those new forms that I learned and I incorporated them into my communicative competence. So I said to the child, Ich bin Andy. Okay, so I paid attention to the language that I heard from the child, and I incorporated this new form called Ich bin, and I used it to introduce myself. Ich bin Andy. So that's the idea of paying attention to the language that you hear and trying to incorporate new forms into your developing communicative competence. Of course, this requires that the input is comprehensible, which comes from Krashen's idea that comprehensible input is very important for communication and language learning. Also, the amount of input should be in the right amount so that the learner can process it. So when the German child spoke to me, he said, Ich bin Karl, and that was in the right amount. If the child spoke to me in long utterances of German, I probably would not be able to process it. But because it was just a small chunk, I was able to process it. And I understood that to introduce yourself in German, you say Ich bin and then your name. Also, another way to do that is you should be in a good emotional state. This also has to do with Stephen Krashen's hypothesis, which is the affective filter hypothesis. The idea that you need to have good emotions. You shouldn't be bothered. You shouldn't be distracted. In order for you to allot effort into language learning. You see, language learning is a difficult process, and it is inhibited and limited by your emotional state. Now, CLT tries to produce learning by trying out and experimenting with different ways of saying things. How would you say this? How would you say that? Okay, so as I said, I used saying, instead of saying pang ilang presidente si Trump. By the way, class, I found out that English for that is which president is Donald Trump. Now, I didn't know that yet, but I tried to experiment with different ways of saying things. I also tried to experiment with creating my own way of saying in English, pang ilang presidente si Donald Trump. I said to my American friend, where is Donald Trump in the chronological order of presidents? Now, that's English, but it's not natural. So my American friend did not understand me. Huh? But then we had negotiation of meaning, clarification, understanding, and so we were able to come to an understanding. So he told me you could say how many presidents before Donald Trump? How many presidents before Donald Trump? Okay, so by experimenting with different ways of saying things, I get the right feedback, and I am able to pick out which ones of those ways of saying would be useful. Okay, now when you try to find ways of saying things, this is called hypothesis testing. You try to you hypothesize, trying to communicate with somebody, and based on your feedback, you modify your hypothesis. So the learner tries to create sentences or utterances, and based on the feedback from others, makes the necessary adjustments to one's own speech. Okay, so once upon a time, there was in my school, there were a bunch of Australian visitors, same age as I was, and the women, they were mostly women. They had to sleep in a house, but then the house was a little bit isolated. So I was tasked to sleep in the house to serve as some sort of guard. But then when I met one of the girls, I said to her, I'm going to sleep with you tonight. And so she got flushed. Because of that feedback, I realized it's not a good way of saying that I'm going to sleep in the house. So I had to make adjustment to my speech. So I told her, "Oh, I mean, I'm going to sleep in your house, not sleep with you." Okay, that really, that's not a good way of saying it. Now, here are some principles of CLT. One principle is that structure or grammar is acquired by understanding and expressing content instead of practicing structure. That's very different from behaviorism. In behaviorism, you try to practice the structure without meaning. But in CLT, it's the content, it's the meaning that you need to focus on. And when you do that, that's the time that you learn the form. You see, class, language and language learning are both counterintuitive. The things that you think would help you learn a language may not actually help you learn a language, just like in behaviorism and audiolingualism, where everybody tried to imitate other people, but they ended up not learning anything much. They ended up not learning much because they focus on the form. But in CLT, you do not focus on the form, you focus on the meaning. And when that happens, structure is acquired. Also, another important principle is that speech must be comprehensible. It's comprehensible through extra linguistic content. So when you say something, you include other clues like your hand gestures or facial expression in order to provide extra linguistic signals. That helps speech comprehensible. And when speech is comprehensible, you're able to process it and learn from it. Also, class, a learner benefits from I plus one input. I plus one means these are the skills that are just a little bit beyond your present set of skills. So that's very much like the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development are the set of skills just beyond your present set of skills. Now, according to Krashen, a teacher must not try to use I plus one. Although I plus one is what benefits an individual person, a teacher must not try to use I plus one in the classroom because it will benefit only one person. Rather, a teacher must try to use approximately I plus one in the classroom. And many people will benefit from that, either from acquiring it from first being exposed to it or by being exposed to it the second time or a third time or other times, which serves as review. Okay. Now, another important principle of communicative language teaching is that the first language may be used to help communication. You see, class, in behaviorism, the use of the first language is a no-no because when you do that, you are employing your old skills. but we need the new skills of the new language. So, according to behaviorism, it's you should not use your first language. But then CLT proponents realize that if you want communication, you can use parts of the first language. Like when your child in elementary would say, Ma'am, in Tagalog po. Or like when I had my Panamanian friend and he said to me, I do to my hair what we say in Spanish as parehar. So if he did not speak at all, I would not have understood him. But because he spoke with a little bit of Spanish, I was able to comprehend what he was trying to say. And I told him that in English, parehar is to even or equalize. So if what you did to your left to the right part of your hair, you also do to the left part of your hair. So you equalize, parehar. A related word to that is parejo or parehas. Okay? According to proponents of communicative language teaching, errors should be used to gain insight into what the learner is doing. Errors should not be discouraged. Rather, you should use them to understand what the learner is trying to do. Like when a learner says, "Foots go, do's bring." A child would say something like that, and it's an error, of course, but you don't need to correct it. Rather, you realize that the child is applying the rules of the language in specific words. Okay? Another principle of communicative language teaching is that there is a difference between language learning, which is explicit and may involve memorization, and learning of grammar rules. There's a difference between that and language acquisition. Because language acquisition is the internalization or imbibing of a particular language aspect. Now, according to CLT, grammar rules should not be taught. That's the idea of being deductive. Instead, it should be inductive. Grammar rules should be acquired inductively. I think this is the only part where CLT and behaviorism agree with each other. Also, in CLT, the role of a teacher is more of facilitator in discussion of tasks. You see, class in behaviorism, the teacher is more of a model. The teacher would say something, and you would try to imitate it. That's in behaviorism. But in CLT, where the emphasis is on tasks, the role of a teacher is more of facilitating and discussing tasks. CLT also makes use of communicative events like buying a newspaper, apologizing, or offering help or expressing one's opinion. So it tries to make use of communicative events. So the learners are immersed into a communicative event, like being in a market buying something. Okay, here are practices of CLT. CLT makes a lot of use of task-based activities. The idea there is as you do the task and as you talk with people in the target language, you end up acquiring the target language. So it makes a lot of use of task-based activities. It also involves interaction with much more knowledgeable individuals. So we discussed that as the very first principle of CLT. Okay, so the idea is you can learn from much more knowledgeable individuals, like Levi Vygotsky said. Now, here are two important kinds of activities in communicative language teaching. The first is fluency activities. The second is accuracy activities. Fluency activities involve being able to, these are activities that help learners speak without pausing. And then you also have accuracy activities where the idea is the learner speaks without making errors. So there should be a good blend of fluency and accuracy activities. Because if it's just fluency, you might not be accurate. If it's accurate, you might be too pausing in your speech. And that would irritate native speakers when you talk to them. So, here are characteristics of accuracy activities. Accuracy activities reflect classroom use of language. Accuracy activities are like using language in a classroom. They focus on the formation of correct examples of language. The idea is you use accuracy activities to help students form correct examples of language. Accuracy activities may practice language out of context because the focus is on the form. So accuracy activities focus on the form. And accuracy activities practice use small samples of language, piece by piece. Okay, unlike in task, you end up with an open amount of language. And accuracy activities do not use meaningful communication and they control the choice of language. So notice class accuracy activities in CLT are like behaviorism in fact it is. Accuracy activities reflect behaviorism. Now class, in the past, proponents of communicative language teaching believe that it's just fluency that you need to develop. So they didn't uh, promote accuracy activities. But later on, proponents of CLT realized that they also need accuracy activities. So it's not just trying to be fluent in the language, but trying to be grammatically, vocabulary, pronunciationally accurate. So accuracy activities are like behaviorism. But then you also have fluency activities. Fluency activities, they're like the natural use of language because they focus on achieving communication. The purpose is not for anything else but to achieve communication. And when you have fluency activities, the idea is you meaningfully use language. You don't just manipulate language out of context, like I'm going to the mall, I'm going to the clinic, when in fact you're not really going there. So that's not meaningful use of language. But meaningful use of language is when you're able to communicate yourself and receive communication. Also, they require the use of communication strategies. There are strategies that you use for you to be understood, for you to clarify, for you to start a conversation. Another characteristic of fluency activities is they produce language that may not be predictable because there's no strict control of language in fluency activities. And fluency activities seek to link language use to context. Everything that you do should be in context, should be related to what's happening around you, which is very different from behaviorism, which is also a way of doing accuracy activities. So, one way to practice is through the use of total physical response, which we will not do because it's online. In the philosophy of total physical response as a language teaching tool is that language learning involving a lot of physical actions is very beneficial. Like when you point to, when you hold on to something, you're experiencing the language. Okay? And total physical response mimics the way kids learn language. So the idea of total physical response, you give simple commands to a person, to a language learner, and he or she would do what you told him to do. Okay? So you react to what students react to what they're told, and which means that language learners usually hear commands. But according to Dr. Asher, the proponent of TPR, it's actually useful also. Commands are useful. They are able to produce the right vocabulary. So class, here's also another way to group CLT activities. You have mechanical activities, meaningful activities, and communicative activities. When we say mechanical activities, these are controlled practice activities which students can successfully carry out without necessarily understanding the language they are using. So these are practices that go with B.S. Skinner's ideas of language. Okay, so the practice the lesson is controlled strictly, and so when that happens, it's like behaviorism. Then we have what we call meaningful activities. These are activities where where language control is still provided, but where students are required to make meaningful choices when carrying out practice. So when you practice English, there are choices. You're given a chance to meaningful choices. Okay, should I use this particular grammar structure? Should I use this particular vocabulary? That's what you have. That's the idea of students being able to make meaningful choices. So here's an example. Here, students are given a set of prepositions and a map. They are asked questions like, where is Julian's house? So when you try to explain, you're not a native speaker, you try to explain in English, there might be a lot of gaps which your professor will fill. Okay? Okay. So we also have communicative activities. Apologize or express your opinion. So the activities practice using language in a real communicative context where you exchange information, and when that happens, the language use is not totally predictable. The people you're talking to might use language that's not predictable for you or not meaningful to you. Okay, so we have mechanical, which are practice activities that are controlled, like repeat after me, like pronunciation drills. Then you have meaningful activities, where it's still a little bit controlled, but students have the freedom to make choices, like how to ask questions like where is Julian's house. And then finally, the communicative activities involve being able to use language in a communicative situation. Okay, in conclusion, class, CLT involves a lot of task based activities in which students have a specific objective to achieve using language. Okay, so I'm going to type into the chat box the attendance form, and you're going to answer a little bit also. You're also going to answer. There's a question there. Ako yung sumagot. I already answered. At sumagot na pala kayo. Oo. So hindi ko na gawing ano to, hindi ko na gawing required to. So hindi na siya required. Okay, so hindi na siya required. So the question about using FB Live is no longer required. Not FB pala, YouTube, hindi FB. Okay, so hindi na required yan. So please answer the attendance sheet. So please answer the attendance sheet. Ginamit ko yung ano, yung I use the same attendance form, but let me check the settings. Okay. So tinanggal ko na yung response. Ayan, so pwede nang sumagot ulit. You can answer again. So may nakalagay na you already responded. So pwede ka na magpadala ulit ng additional response. Tinanggal ko na yung requirement na isang beses lang pwedeng sagutan. So nakakailan na tayo sumagot. I now have several people. But try to give a comment through the use of YouTube. Try to provide an answer to the question, kamusta ba ang paggamit ng YouTube Live? Okay, thank you dun sa mga nagbigay ng comment. Okay, thank you very much, class. And the form will still be a little bit available in a few minutes, but you are dismissed now. Thank you very much.